Sesibile ukukeleza nathi right here on SABC 1 Mzansi for sure. Njobo wazi ukuthi with the ultimate best in education, information and entertainment. When enza show ukuthi each and every weekday morning join between 5 a.m. till 6 a.m. So manje asiyani kuptumi sibona ukuthi siphatheleni for the first question of the day.
We are all about the education. Unfortunately, ham futa ka mala na yellow bone ke brown bone. Mara he obuhlalo tshwana le nna mfutsitse. Ausi tumeleng. Before you give us your question, about your plans next year.
Well, next year kitla be na UJ. Yeah, I have applied, and then I want to do law with LLB.
Question for our teacher in studio.
How would you answer the question like this from a previous question paper starting with an N? All we have to do is to rewrite the following sentence in a passive voice, but then starting with an N. Here's the sentence. The 18-year-old had developed an illness causing paralysis. Starting with an N.
Thank you very much for that question. Here's the question for you again. How would you answer the following question? It's off a past matric exam paper. Rewrite the following sentence in the passive voice starting with the given word. The 18-year-old had developed an illness causing paralysis. Start with an. Okay, Bafethu, before siqala ukuphendula lo mbuzo lo, the first thing that you need to know is what is voice? When you talk about voice, we are talking about the finite verb in a sentence. And now that we know what voice is, we need to differentiate between the active and the passive voice. So let's get on to that. When we say a verb is in the active voice, we mean that the subject does the verb or is the verb. Here's an example. I am Tandega. Now, for those of you who have forgotten, when you have a sentence, the subject answers the question who or what. So in this instance, who or what? It's I. Who is? I am Tandega. So the reason that this is active is because I am being Tandega. I'm not doing anything, but I am being. So the subject is being. So the subject can either do the thing or it can just be, okay? Don't get too confused. It's very simple. The finite verb in the sentence is am. The subject is I, which we've already just looked at. You cannot say that I am doing anything. I am just being. The verb is in active voice because I am doing the being. So here's another example for you. Gelezanati brings you the best lessons. Who or what brings you the best lessons is Gelezanati. So we've already identified our subject there. And then what is the verb? The verb would be brings, right? And then now, what do we say? Okay, so we see that the subject is doing the verb. So the verb is in the active voice. Gelezanati brings you the best lessons. Okay, so Gelezanati is doing what? It's bringing you the best lessons, okay? Remember, when a verb is in the active voice, the subject is doing the action of the verb or is being the verb. That's something that's very important for you to remember. Now let us look at passive voice. The passive voice is when something is done to the subject. So for example, this is not on the slide, so just listen carefully. If I were to say, Tso kicked the ball, that is in the active voice. How do I now change it to something being done to Tso? We can say that the ball was kicked by Tso. Let's look at this in detail. Gelezanati is broadcast every day of the week. That's the active example that we have, and now we have to change it. To decide whether the verb is active or passive, you need to be able to firstly find the verb and then the subject. When you decide those two, you can decide whether or not the subject is doing the action of the verb or whether something is being done to the subject. So we already know how to identify the subject and we already know what the verb is. So the first two steps are very easy for us. Then the next thing that you need to do, how do we make an active sentence passive? A sentence can be made passive only if it has an object. Remember my example about Tso kicking the ball? We had that ball being our object. So that's how I was then able to turn it to passive. To change the sentence from active to passive, find the object and start the passive sentence with the object. So you start with the object. Then make the verb passive and then add in by and put the subject after by. So the ball was being kicked by Zo. Remember that example? I have another example here for you. The participants play a game each week. So this is the active. Now let us look at it once I have changed it to being passive. First of all, we can see that a game, I have started with my object, right? That was the first thing that you need to start with. Then we say is played. An important thing here, guys, is that when you are changing from active to passive, your verb has to stay the same. Remember, we are not changing the meaning of the sentence. We are not changing the sentence. So if it was past tense or if it's present tense, the tense stays the same. So a game is played each week by the participants. Now, the each week, we'll look at it a bit later. Let's just forget about this for 2 seconds. The next thing that remember we had to do was add by, and then after the by, we had our subject. Now, our subject is participants. Then each week, you can decide where you want to add it. In my example, I've put each week after is played. Rather, I've put each week after the verb, so the sentence can make sense. Of course, you can do it in any other way, but this is how I've chosen to do it. A game is played each week by the participants. That's the example I've got for you. The sentence is now passive because the subject, a game, is not doing the playing. It is being played by someone else. Okay, so passive to active. Find the word by and take it out. That's the first step. Start your active sentence with the person after by. So now you're starting with your subject. Remember, because by comes before your subject. Then make the verb active and put the subject of the passive sentence as the object of the active sentence. Here's an example for those of you who might be confused. In the morning, the lessons were taught by the old teacher. So as you can see, this is passive and now we need to change it. In the morning, we've kept in the morning at the beginning of the sentence. The old teacher taught the lessons. Now what you can see here is that the old teacher, who is our subject, is now doing the teaching. The old teacher taught the lessons. So as you can see now, we removed by. By is no longer here. Remember, the by helped you to change it to passive. So when you are speaking in the active voice, you'd no longer need by. And now the difference here is, instead of having your teacher or the subject at the end of the sentence, you can have it at the beginning where you say the old teacher taught the lessons. It's always important to remember that when you're changing to active, the subject is doing something. Okay, so the subject is doing something. Nothing is being done to the subject. That's something that you need to hold on to. So that's it that I've got for you as far as active and passive. But do try some examples because I know I always get questions on the active and passive voice, guys. So that is all that I have for you right now for the first question.
Dumela ausi.
Aya but
O phetse hantle.
ha ntse ke phetse.
Jwale he o komplele hore potso ya hao for our teacher in studio is. Okay.
Okay, my question is that can you tell me more about the verb when going from an active voice to a passive voice and the other way around?
Siyabonga kakhulu sisi for that question. For those of you who didn't hear it, here is the question again. Can you tell me more about the verb when you are going from active to passive voice and the other way around? Okay, as I have mentioned before, when we are changing from active to passive, we have to look at the verb as far as we don't change the tense because we want to maintain the meaning of the actual sentence. So let us have a look here what we've got. When you are dealing with active and passive voice, you must keep the verb in the same tense or the same mood. So here are some examples for you. If in active voice, the verb is play or plays, in passive voice you would have it as is or are played. So when you have another example here with the word play is rather with act. You say act or acts, that becomes is or are acted. So as you can see, we are maintaining the same tense here. That's the main thing that you need to look at. And as you can see, you add is or are. What these two do is they maintain the same tense without even having to change the meaning of the sentence. Because I can see maybe some of you are confused. We went from act to are acted or is acted. The is and the are keeping it in present tense. Okay, so don't get confused because you see acted and you're thinking, but the rule is when we go from present to past tense, you add ed. Don't worry about that. Is acted, that keeps the tense the same. More examples here. So from past tense, if it says played, then you're going to say was or were played. So what I'm basically doing now is giving you a number of examples that you are most likely to come across when you have to change from passive to active. Okay, so in the past tense, we are still in the past tense and we have acted. You would say was or were acted. So you can see that you're either going to add was or were when it is in the past tense. Now, the present progressive continuous tense, okay? So we all know that's the ing generally. So here are some examples of how you would change it in this instance. From the active voice, you would say is or are playing, and then when you change it to passive, you are going to say is or are being played. So if you were to say, for example, Mbui is playing soccer. Okay, or you'd say Mbui is kicking the ball. I like kicking the ball, that's my favorite example. So if you said Mbui is kicking the ball, then in the passive voice you would say the ball is being kicked by Mbui. Okay, so that's an example of how it's done. Here we've got is or are acting. Then when you change it to passive, you're going to say is or are being acted. So I'm sure you've noticed here that we have being that we add there. And then let's look at the past tense in relation to the continuous and all of that. We have was or were playing, and then in the passive would become was or were being played. Okay, I've got a few more examples there. Now, I want us to talk about quickly the modal verbs. If the verb has a modal auxiliary, for example, might, may, can, shall, could, or would, you must keep the same auxiliary. This form also uses the verb be with the main verb. So here is a quick example there. If you've got might, for example, you'd say might be played, okay? So that's just an example that I've got for you as far as the modal verbs are concerned. I hope that answers your question.